So this is the 10th lecture, and in the previous 9 I've been at some pains to document the incredible structure of human language, its semantic structure, its syntactic structure. And the question, of course, arises, and in particular, is it comparable to other cognitive systems that pre-existed? There are other cognitive systems in our total psyche. There's, if you divide them up very roughly, there would be things like perception in general, which include the several modalities like visual perception and motor and kinesthetic perception, auditory perception. There is, as another cognitive system, there's motor control. There's the affect system of emotions and so forth. And there's the reasoning system. And each of these, the attentional system, each of these systems has a certain kind of organizational system and set of structuring features. And the one question that arises is, the last two main cognitive systems to have evolved were language and culture, language and cultural structure, because I propose that there's a cognitive system devoted to cultural structure. So as they evolved, the question is, were they able to exhaustively provide for their own organizational makeup simply by borrowing bits and pieces from the other cognitive systems that were already in place, or did they have to, did something new have to evolve? And my proposal, the general proposal here is that, in fact, language, when it evolved, as it evolved, in over who knows how long a period, certainly hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps over a million, the proposal here is that it had to, in fact, to overcome a certain bottleneck, it had to have evolved a certain property, which I'm calling digitalization. Most of the other cognitive systems, in most of their functions, or in much of their function, are analog in character, sort of involving gradients, iconic aspects. And for language to perform its function, my proposal is that it had to evolve, either elaborate what was already in existence elsewhere but minimal, or evolve afresh this new kind of digital system, which I'll describe in a second. It at least involves discrete kinds of units. So here was the evolutionary problem that might have faced, I'm speaking metaphorically, of course, none of this is, I mean, evolution is not teleological, and there's no, but just to speak metaphorically, early hominids might have faced a kind of bottleneck, if you think of it that way, of two opposing tendencies. One was hominids were presumably increasingly getting smarter, so they were having more and more conceptual capacity in their cognition. And the issue was, as that happened, the bottleneck was between increasing capacity for conceptual content, which would have included a greater range of just qualitative conceptual content, a greater range of granularity, whether it's a generic content or fine-grained content, it would a greater range of complexity, simple or intricate, and so forth. All of this might have been on the verge of evolving or been in progress of evolving, together with the communication of that, the interaction of that, of such concepts within an individual hominid to its fellows. How much interaction could there be? And you would necessarily, it would be on the verge of increasing thought capacity with the need for also, it would have been selectively positive to be able to increase the capacity to communicate more of that more quickly with greater fidelity. The bottleneck was that the means for communication at that point in the auditory, in the vocal auditory channel, this channel between mouth and ear, was highly limited. It had many constraints, limitations, which, as they were constituted at that time in evolution, were inadequate for as a carrying capacity for this increasing or potentially increasing capacity of thought and its communication to across members of the species. And it was limited for about 4 different reasons. One is it had what I'm calling low parallelness. It had relatively few independent parameters of variation that it could vary, the auditory channel. I'll elaborate all this in a second. But it had very low iconicity, both of which would have been advantageous. It had relatively little degree of differentiation within auditory. The auditory range was relatively limited, and the medium was noisy. The medium through air was rather noisy. So what happened? And my suspicion is that the resolution to this bottleneck, mind you, the bottleneck probably has existed at many places and many species at many times during evolution, and it may never have been resolved. But it could be that the hominids were the first to have evolved the relevant mutations that wound up resolving this bottleneck. And what it was that the means for communication, the vocal auditory tract, became increasingly digital in character. So from having been primarily analog, meaning involving gradients and iconic kinds of things, to being increasingly digital. So here's what I mean by digital. It encompasses 4 steps. First, instead of gradients, it can have discrete units within it. So that's the first level, it has discrete units. So discrete, as opposed to a gradient analog kind of thing. Secondly, the units could be simply discrete steps along a dimension, or here's the next step of what I mean by digitalization. Each discrete unit could also have its own categorical distinct identity. It's this instead of just a discrete jumps along a single parameter, it could have, this is a distinct, qualitatively distinct category of thing, this is another distinct category of thing. So that's the second step in digitalness, in being digital. The third one, and all of these appear in language. I should say that the first 2 also appear in some, both there's discreteness and qualitatively distinct categories for these distinct chunks, also appear in other cognitive systems, like in visual perception and in motor control, I suspect. So those 2, there are precursors for. So language could easily, as it evolved, have borrowed or tapped into those pre-existent forms of digitalness in other cognitive systems. There are 2 more steps, though, to what I call digitalization. The next is recombination, is my term for it, on the notion of recombinant DNA. It's that where you have several, if you have an inventory of certain set of discrete categories, do they simply remain in their home sites where they originate, or can they recombine? In other words, enter into different arrangements relative to each other, so enter into different patterns. So that's what I call recombination. And you were already starting to see less of this kind of phenomenon, recombination, in other cognitive systems. I mean, I'm a novice when it comes to looking at other cognitive systems, but a glance through them with my novice status suggests that there's relatively less recombination present in other cognitive systems. The fourth step in what I call digitalization is where each of these arrangements, each of these distinct rearrangements of the units, in turn constitutes a new higher level entity. It's what I call emergentness. So on the one hand, it could just remain just patterns, just different arrangements, or the different arrangements could, in turn, each arrangement could have its own new identity, constitute its own identity. Just to orient you quickly to what I'm referring to, the commonest example of that is phonemes into morphemes. So you have, let's say, phonemes k, a, and t in English. Well, you can recombine them in different orders, like cat, tack, act. And furthermore, each of these different arrangements has a new higher level identity as a novel morpheme, each with its own meaning. So each of these three combinations I just gave you, it has its own meaning and is understood cognitively. It's experienced cognitively as discrete higher level units. So that's the basic idea. So there's four levels to what I'm calling digitalization. And it seems to me that the first two steps, as language evolved, it could easily have borrowed from other cognitive systems. But the second two steps, they may exist. We'll perhaps, if we have time, see examples, putative examples in other cognitive systems. But if they're there, they're relatively minimal, I think. And so language either borrowed them already pre-existing and then greatly elaborated it, or it evolved it afresh for the first time and also greatly elaborated it. And in doing so, it happened for the first time in hominid evolution, and it resolved the bottleneck. It now permitted the means of communication, this vocal auditory channel, to have the carrying capacity to express, to represent all of these different, this large number of distinct concepts, and do so with some fidelity in this noisy medium by virtue of being digital, and to do it quickly. So that's the general layout of the thing. And the steps that I'll take in analyzing this is, first is to show how the vocal auditory channel is in fact very limited in its capacity. It has limited capacity. And I'll demonstrate that first by comparing it with another channel, the one used in sign language, the manual visual channel. Manual visual channel is another channel. Each of these two channels has a production and a perception component. The vocal part of the vocal auditory channel is the production part. The auditory is the perception part. In sign language, you have the manual, or more generally, bodily, facial gesticulations. And the perception part of it is visual. So I'm going to contrast the vocal auditory channel with the manual visual channel, and we'll see that the manual visual channel has many more advantages, is much less limited, much less constrained than the vocal auditory channel. If, for whatever reason, if it had been chosen, if it had wound up being the channel used for communication, which it wasn't, if it had been, a number of certain elements of this bottleneck might have been resolved at the outset. There might not have been a bottleneck. But for whatever reasons, the vocal auditory channel was the one that got involved in further evolution of communication. And so it had a bottleneck. So the first thing I'm going to do is to compare and contrast these two channels, these two modalities of communication, to show how limited the vocal auditory channel is. And the first way in which it's limited is in terms of parallelness. By this I mean how many distinct independent parameters does the modality have, does the channel have, each of which can vary independently. And it turns out that the manual visual channel has a very large number. The vocal auditory channel has relatively few. And the advantage to having many parallel parameters, each of which can independently and concurrently express some channel of information, is that you can communicate more information in the same unit of time if you've got more channels in parallel. It's a broadband as opposed to a narrow band. So you can communicate more information in the same unit of time, or if you have a certain amount of communication, it'll take you less time to convey everything if you've got multiple channels to do it on. So let's look at the number of distinct parameters available in each channel. So let's first look at the vocal auditory channel. I count 8. The main one is itself, the main one that language in fact uses, is itself a digital system. It's a discrete system, and it's digital. Whether it evolved later or pre-existed among animal communication systems, I'm not sure. But in any case, it's the parameter of the distinction between pa, ta, ka, ba, da, ga, man, and all the different vowels and so forth. I'm calling that phonetic quality. And it's a discrete system. So that's one parameter. There's 7 more parameters, which collectively I call vocal dynamics, and it is a gradient system. It includes things like loudness, softer, louder, rate of, I'll do pitch, how high, how low, timbre. Timbre is the vocal quality. If you talk narrow nasal voice, or if you talk like that kind of this timbre thing. The thing that distinguishes different instruments from each other. Several other features, like how enunciated the things are, or various other vocal qualities like nasality and so forth. And then there are 2 temporal ones: the rate that something is that things go faster or slower, or the duration of which anything is held shorter or longer. Okay, and I suspect that this vocal dynamics set of parameters, these 7, 7 is not inscribed in stone, and maybe there's 8, maybe there's 9, I don't know, however you divide it, but in any case, it's a gradient system, it's an analog system, and I suspect it's a more ancient system, which was already present in animal communication. Animals have long since had capacity to vary things in terms of magnitude, like loudness or extent of gesture, speed and pitch and all those kinds of things. So those have long been. I suspect that analog system is more ancient and simply was carried over into modern day language as a vocal dynamics system, side by side with the newly evolving phonetic quality system, which in its digital character. That's my guess. By contrast, go look at the number of parameters, separate individually variable parameters. By the way, each of these parameters, these 8 in spoken language, in language, can be varied independently. They're all totally independently variable. So they owe nothing to each other. There's a list of some 30, by my count. This is like my analysis of it, and I'm a novice in sign language analysis, but this is one count that I've made, and others may well disagree, but anyway, this is one, of some 30 independently variable parameters that are present in the sign language system. specifically this is the part of the talk that I gave, I don't know which, 6th talk or something, or 5th talk, where I went in detail into contrasting the spoken language system for representing the spatial domain and the sign language one. So in particular, all sign languages, there are many different sign languages, including a Mandarin sign language, one spoken one signed in China, at least parts of China. But I'll illustrate with the American Sign Language, ASL. All sign languages, it seems, have a specific subsystem, which is generally called a classifier subsystem. Poorly named, but that's what it's called. And it's independent of it's separate from the system of lexical signs, like this is the lexicon sign for book, this is lexicon sign for enter, and their modulations. That's a separate kind of system. The classifier subsystem is totally devoted to representing objects moving with respect to each other in space. That's all it does. So I'll repeat the example that I gave when I gave this talk. The one hand, the right hand, the dominant hand, in my case the right hand, represents the object that's moving or located, the figure. So it could be like a ground vehicle or an aeronautic vehicle or an animal or a person moving along. Could be any of these. And the other hand is the ground object, the reference object with respect to which the figure moves. So this could be a tree. And so could be a car drove past the tree. But in addition, you can vary many aspects of it. So, and these are all independent parameters which can be represented concurrently with each other and each varied separately. So this first is the path. Then relative to the ground, it could be past. Then it could be up a hill, drove past the tree up a hill. Could be up a curved hill. Could be up a bumpy curved hill. Could be fast. Could be the road could pass close to the tree or far from the tree, this way or this way. Let's say it's close to the tree. It could start further away, or it could start close to the arm and end further away. So all of these things are possible, and you're concurrently layering one kind of dimension, one kind of parameter on top of another. So each of these that I just mentioned is listed separately as one of these 30 on the list. So I'll skip through the 30 and then we'll go right past it. And then so in addition to simply having more available independent parameters in any given channel, you also have to use them. I mean, they might be available, but do you use them? Well, it turns out that using sign language, modern-day sign language, yes, every one of these 30 that I have on the list is used a lot independently. Whereas, so if you can say that if there's a category of parameter range, you can say that sign language has parameter spread. It has it uses all of its different parameters. Spoken language, spoken language for its part, with its 8, even though it has 8, it has relatively few, but it doesn't use all of them very much to convey most of its conceptual content. It mainly relies on the first one, the phonetic quality one, in which, by the way, I would include tones in Chinese under number 1, rather than pitch. So it has what I would call parameter concentration. Even though it has a few parameters at least, it uses parameter number 1 more than all the other parameters together to convey conceptual content. So it has parameter concentration. And the interesting thing is that with parameter spread, One thing that sign languages do is, in this particular classifier subsystem, is it uses different kinds of movement to represent different kinds of conceptual content. True, the conceptual content all pertains to objects moving relative to each other in space, but still that has different aspects to it, and a number of different aspects are separately separately represented by different ones of the parameters. So, for example, the kind of object moving is represented by the hand shape. Is it a car or a plane? The distance between the figure and the ground is represented by the distance between the figure and the ground. The speed at which it's moving is represented by the speed at which it's moving. The angle of the path is represented by the angle of the path, straight. So you've got, I mean, first of all, that's iconic, but that's not the point here. The point here is that you've got a subdivision of qualitatively different kinds of information, conceptual content, represented severally by distinct different kinds of motions. So they're categorized into different slots, into different cubby holes. Whereas spoken language is radically different from this. All of this whole range of conceptual content with all its different kinds is all channeled down into one parameter, phonetic quality. All the different phonemes, and as they are grouped together into morphemes and then into sentences. True, you have all that, but it's all funneled together into just one type of parameter. So all these distinctions as to speed, rate. I mean, for example, if I try to say this in English, if I try to say something like the car sped bumpily up past the tree on a curved road or something like that. So I'm trying to find the closest English equivalent to this business. It's all done with one parameter, phonetic quality. It's not subdivided. The different types of information are not subdivided into separate different kinds of motions. So there's an example of parameter concentration for you. And presumably the logic of it, why this happened, is that as it evolved, spoken language, in order to overcome this bottleneck, had to rely on digitalization, and it did so in a big way. It picked one parameter, went digital with it, and it put all its eggs in this one basket. Okay, the second comparison between spoken and sign language is, all this is by way of showing the limitations of the vocal auditory channel. It'll prove relevant in a bit later, but for now, just to be complete in this, let's look over what's needed, what's available in a channel. Any channel is necessarily both a production and a perception channel. So for anything to serve as an available parameter in it, it has to be good for both components of the channel. Well, there are some things in each of these channels that are unavailable precisely because they only exist in one of the components. So, for example, in the manual visual channel, some relevant distinctions are available visually to the perceptual part, such as texture of something or color, but are not readily representable by manual representations. There's a bit of texture stuff in ASL, like this is dotted stuff, but it's relatively it's relatively minimal. And you certainly can't represent color manually in this same system. I mean, you can do it as a lexical sign, but not in this classifier system. And then the other way around, there's some things available manually which aren't available, can't be perceived, namely pressure, degree of pressure. And interestingly, there is a language for the people who are both blind and deaf, which is manual, and that one does have available to a degree of pressure. But the standard manual visual modality does not. And so those three kinds of characteristics, qualities, conceptual types, are not included in that channel. Comparably, in the vocal auditory channel, some things are available to audition, to hearing, which is not available to speech. And the main one, which is going to be important, is that you can hear the location of an object, a bird tweeting over there, or something, or a bird flying through the air along a certain path. You can hear it. You can hear locations, sites, and paths. But you can't produce it vocally. You can't, dummies can throw their voice. That's the term in English, to throw your voice, but it's not true. You can't do it. If you could make your voice sound like it's coming from over there or sound like it's moving, but it can't be done. And if it could, then language would have a nice available parameter for representing paths and sites in space, but it doesn't. And similarly, there are aspects of things that can be done vocally that you can't hear, like you can make all sorts of motions inside your mouth, but if you don't breathe them out, you can't hear it. So, okay, so that's kind of fleshes out this particular range. Okay, let's switch to the next one, which is iconicity. And again, the upshot is going to be that the manual visual channel is highly, or can be highly iconic, whereas the vocal auditory channel is highly uniconic, or in terms of relevant iconicity. The reason for going at some length into this, what sign language can do, is it's an existence proof. It shows that we have the cognitive capacity to represent and to convey concepts through a system which is massively parallel and massively iconic. It could have been the system used. It could have been the channel that wound up being the main communicative channel. It wasn't, but it has a kind of existence proof demonstration for its cognitive feasibility. So that's one of the main reasons for going through this. And now the advantage to iconicity is that if you've got a communication system which is iconic, it can directly represent the concept that it's standing for. Its very own nature, its own form, will automatically represent the content. And that's an advantage, because without that, you have to independently develop symbols. You have to have a whole new cognitive kind of phenomenon, which is symbols, which is where one kind of thing represents another kind of thing, or one kind of form represents a concept that is unrelated to. It has no commonality across them. And that might be cognitively costly. It might, it means that you have to have, if it's an extensive system of communication, it means you've got to have a whole additional cognitive system for a set of symbols of unrelated things, correlating unrelated things, and a whole set of processes for encoding and decoding. You have to encode the idea into a set of unrelated symbols, and the hearer has to decode them into back into the concepts. So all of this could be cognitively costly, so that's why it presumably is an advantage to have as much iconicity as possible. Well, spoken language doesn't have it, and that's this whole section of the talk is to demonstrate the limitations on the vocal auditory system, which is why it wasn't, as it was constituted back in the early hominid days, it was inadequate to the task at hand. That's why there was a bottleneck. So let's go through some of the, to demonstrate this, let me first describe what I think iconicity entails, and it's because there really hasn't been a good analysis of iconicity, so it calls for some kind of closer analysis, and here is one. First of all, I would distinguish it between minimal iconicity and a strong iconicity with additional correlating elements or features. Minimal iconicity is when you've got two things which I'll call a form and an entity, where one aspect of the form represents some aspect of the entity, and that aspect is identical across the two. So you've got iconicity if you've got some aspect of the form that's identical to some aspect of an entity, and it represents it. And then you can say that aspect is iconic of that aspect. That aspect of the form is iconic of that aspect of the entity. So an example, the English word way can refer to at a great distance. So if I say it's way over there, it means it's over there at a great distance between me and it. Okay? But now, spoken language does have just a bit of iconicity. In this case, it has, you could say it's way over there. Extend the vowel, it's way over there. Then, what you've got now is an aspect of the form. The aspect of the form is increased vowel duration. And that represents increased extra distance. So if it's way over there, then it's further than it was if you just said it's way over there. So we've got iconicity. The iconicity is that there is a particular dimension, namely increased quantity along some parameter. And in this case, it's along the parameter of vowel duration. So it's increased there. And it's here, in terms of the referent, it's increased distance of separation in space. And this, furthermore, this increased duration represents that increased separation, so it's iconic of it. Okay, that's minimal iconicity. In addition, you want covariation. And you have a part of strong iconicity. The first part is if you've got covariation. So that's an addition to it. So, for example, covariation means if you've got several different versions of this aspect, and several other different versions in the entity, and they correlate. I'm calling it covariation. So, for example, if I say it's way over there, this length correlates with that. This duration correlates with that length. If I say it's way over there, that extra vowel duration correlates with that extra increased length, much longer. Another one is that they are, what's the term I use? Proportional. So it could have been that simply there are several different versions of this aspect, just different lengths. It could be that short length corresponds, the shorter one of the extra lengths corresponds with the longest one of the spatial length, and they wouldn't have had to correspond. But if they correspond in line, shorter, medium, and of the extra vowel durations, way, forming a line, then they are proportional to each other. If that is, in fact, iconic with, in agreement with the shorter extra length, middle extra length, longest extra length, then fine. They're also in agreement in terms of proportionality. And if they do it in step instead of reverse, then they are in fact directly proportional. That's the third one. So they have proportional directness. as opposed to, it could be that the longer you say the vowel, the shorter the extra length is. But no, it's the longer the vowel is, the longer the vowel duration, the longer the extra distance. So they're covariant, co-proportional, and co-direct in their proportionality. In addition, you can have co-granularity. So, I mean, you have the issue of if they're co-granular. So that means if they're, by granularity, I mean if something is either continuous or discrete. Well, in this case, they are also co-granular. The vowel duration can be increased in length continuously. And that corresponds approximately with a continuous increase in extra length of separation, extra distance. There are other cases in English, so they are co-granular, and in particular, they are co-gradient. There are other cases where there's they're not the same form of granularity. So you can say the bird flew up, up, and away, or the bird flew up, 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 and away, or the bird flew up, 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 and away. Actually, Superman did that. So that's the phrase from Superman's comic books. Well, here we've got on the language side, the form side, it is discrete. How many ups have you said? So it's discrete, but it's referring to a gradient degree of distance. So you've got a disconnect. So these two forms are not iconic with respect to this parameter of granularity, whereas the way one is. Finally, they can be codimensional. As it turns out, that's the final. If you've got all of these, then you have the strongest form degree of iconicity. If you've got, as it turns out, the example with it's way over there lacks this codimensionality. That's because way exists in the dimension or the domain of vowel duration in time, whereas the entity that it's referring to refers to the domain of distance and space. So they are not codimensional. They lack that iconicity. But maybe if you had an example, if you use the word loud, if you could in English, I don't know if you can, but if you could use the word loud, just the word loud, and say it louder and louder to refer to how loud something was, he spoke loud, he spoke loud, like that, then you are all of these things plus being codimensional, because the very loudness that you're using is in the same dimension or domain as what it's referring to. So that's the strongest, if that exists, it probably does, that's the strongest degree of iconicity you can have. Okay, so that's by way of characterizing iconicity. Okay, so now let's look at the, so it turns out that spoken language has an enormous amount of iconicity, and it's often of the strongest type. So for example, almost of those 30 parameters I gave you for sign language, all but the first two are really iconic, and many of them have the strongest form. So for example, if I indicate that something is moving in this classificatory system, if I indicate that something is moving up like that, it's strongly iconic in all 6 ways. So it's if it means that it's moving up, it indicates that that the object, if my hand moves up, it indicates that the object I'm referring to has moved up. It doesn't mean that it moved down. It doesn't mean that it moved in a circle. It doesn't mean that it got brighter. It means all the same things. Furthermore, it's even in the same dimension, because it's in fact both the form and the referent are in space. They share a domain. So it has the strongest form of iconicity. Furthermore, it's all the different 30 parameters are relevant. It turns out that relevance is important in this realm of iconicity. Some aspect, something could be iconic but of low communicative relevance. So it turns out that spatial aspects of objects are of high degree of relevance in communication. People are often talking about objects located and moving through space. So it's high degree of relevance. By contrast with, let's say, the temperature of objects. People seldom talk about the temperature of objects. So of all the properties of things that are around, the locations and paths of objects is relevant to communication. Their temperatures is not, or is low. Why that should be is itself another question. It's a separate question, which it can be investigated separately. It's not part of this investigation. Okay, so it turns out that all these 30 things that I just showed for sign language are, in fact, relevant. Other things that might be relevant to communication in sign language, such as degree of pressure, color, and texture, cannot be readily represented in this classifier subsystem. So by contrast, is a case of things that are relevant for communication, more or less, I presume they're relevant, but are not readily represented. By contrast, yeah. Let's switch to spoken language. It has extremely little iconicity. First of all, it has several degrees of iconicity, several forms of iconicity, which it does have, but just simply aren't of much relevance to communication. For example, timbre, one of the parameters of language, of spoken language, is iconic. In fact, it's strongly iconic. If, for example, I changed my voice in a way that sounded like some other person's timbre or way of talking, if I imitated George Bush, let's say. But it's seldom relevant in communication. I mean, I guess it could have been, but doesn't come up much. So here's a form of available iconicity which is not relevant. Secondly, and here's the part which it's kind of curious to me, there are kinds of iconicity, there are forms of iconicity which spoken language does have and which are extremely relevant, but curiously don't get used in the language system. I don't know why, but I can show how they might have been used if they were used. For example, they pertain to the temporal parameters, rate and duration. It could be that you could have used rate. Often you want to talk about how fast things move. It could have been that you could speak faster for something that moves faster and speak slower for something that moves slower in an iconic way. So, for example, if language could have been arranged in such a way that I could have said, the pen lay on the table, rolled to the edge, and fell off. But it doesn't exist. Similarly, you could have had an iconic system of duration, where you would, how long you took to say something or didn't say something, the pauses between could have been iconic with the duration of the thing you're referring to. So, for example, you could have said, I came in the room, sat down, and fell asleep. Okay, so you could have had durational extents built into language, which were iconic with the thing that they're representing, but that never worked its way into the system. Again, why, I don't know. Possibly because language became so, put all its eggs into the one basket of phonetic quality that it just ignored the other parameters which were available to it for use in conveying additional dimensions of conceptual content. Finally, language doesn't have available to it, spoken language doesn't have available to it all sorts of aspects which are iconic at all. In particular, the main thing it lacks is any means of representing objects moving through space. precisely because, as I indicated, you can't throw your voice and speak in a way that indicates where the objects are, then that whole, as you can in sign language, you can just indicate where something is. You can't do it vocally. You could hear it, but you can't produce it vocally. So spoken language, that channel is simply missing out on one of the great relevant parameters for communication, for things that people want to talk about. So by these means, by this analysis, you can see that as a channel, the vocal auditory channel really is rather low in its available relevant iconicity. And so therefore, that was another part of its constraint, limitation, that provided the bottleneck. Okay, so all of this has been by way of showing how the vocal auditory channel was highly limited. It created the bottle of the bottleneck. It's what in that metaphor prevented speedy, subtle communication of different concepts, and it didn't change in terms of evolution. It had to stay the same. There's no way to overcome these limitations within spoken language, within that channel. But to get around it, as a means of getting around that limitation, it developed this other thing, which I'm going to talk about next, namely digitalization, or digitalness. It developed digitalness as a means to compensate for these limitations which it couldn't overcome. By the nature of the entity, it couldn't overcome them. This whole last section has also been by way of showing, to bring into relief what these limitations were, by showing another channel that we, in fact, as humans, have available and, in fact, use in the deaf community, that would have been viable. It's cognitively feasible, but for whatever reason didn't get hit on as the channel for evolving further communicative capacity. Okay, so the next whole section is to document how digital language in fact is. The way this has worked out is it's to show that spoken language, or I'll just say language now, as a vocal auditory channel, has in fact developed an enormous amount of digitalness, perhaps as many as 8 different forms of it, each with its own specific characteristics. Many of them, in fact, all of them are, in the terms of the 4-way distinction, all of them are at least discrete. All of them are at least categorial. All of them are recombinant, different arrangements. All these, the ones that I'm going to indicate to you now, have all those properties. Some of them also, about 3 or 4 of them, are emergent, have an additional higher level kind of identity of object. And possibly language may have more than any other cognitive system, and for that matter, it may have it and other cognitive systems may not. That depends on what is the case about other cognitive systems. So, and that presumably, if we look at 2 points, we can't track the evolution of it because there's the intervening steps are non-existent. I mean, those critters haven't survived. But we can look at present-day language, and so we as linguists can identify the ways in which language is digital. We can project back to a time, retroject, I guess, back to a time when you can imagine that whatever vocal auditory system there was not digital in this way, and therefore presume that it has to have evolved in the course of evolution, and then you can speculate on possible sequences for it and how, which element came in, which stages came in when, and so forth. Okay, so this first section on this 5 really recapitulates what I said at the outset. I mean, so I won't go through it again. I guess 5.1 does that. Is that right? Yes. Yeah. So I won't go through it again. It's the 4 things that I consider to be part of digitalness. I go into some greater detail into what I mean by recombination. I develop it more explicitly. It's the notion that there is some, in each of these cases, in each of these 8 cases where we've got digitalness in language, we've got an inventory of discrete, unitized, qualitatively, categorially distinct elements, and their recombination takes place by, from this inventory, selecting a subset of them, so taking some number of them, putting them in some arrangement, and that arrangement has certain properties, certain characteristics that are unique to that form of digitalness. It arranges it in certain ways. For example, it can arrange in terms of temporal concurrence. It can arrange sequentially in adjacency to each other, contiguity, different forms of arrangement, and each one will have different constraints on what govern the possible arrangements, the patterns of arrangement. Each one of them has different constraints. And so, in other words, of these 8, it turns out that language has been so efflorescent in its, so exuberant in its evolution of digitalness that it, in fact, in some, maybe you could say it evolved 8 different kinds of digitalness, each with its own patterns of arrangement and constraints on them. So let's go over some of them. I mean, much of this is familiar to linguists. It's of greater news to cognitive scientists who aren't linguists, who may not know this about language, whereas what I'm going to go through now is largely the material studied by linguists, so I won't dwell on it because I guess we're mostly linguists here. So there are some things which are analog in, and I'm going to divide this into the formal portion of language and the semantic portion. So first, the formal aspect of language. There are things in language which are analog, as we saw. So the vocal dynamics are analog. So to go next, the next thing is, yeah, so things that are, so now, aspects which are in fact recombinant, and some of them will be emergent. So phonetic features recombine in different ways to form distinct phonemes in any given language. So in any given language, there's an inventory of phonetic features, and for any given phoneme in that language, some subset of those features are selected and combined to form the phoneme. And the phoneme, it's not only an arrangement, but the phoneme has a new higher level identity, which is unrelated to its features. So it's an emergent unit as well. So it's got the highest form of digitalness. And the kind of arrangement is concurrence. So the various phonetic features co-occur with each other. And the constraint on them seems to be simply whether they're compatible with each other. If you can pronounce them, move your mouth in a way that makes them feasible for pronunciation. Okay, that's enough for that. The next example is phonemes into morphemes. And again, we've got an inventory of, in any given language, of phonemes. And for any given, in any given case, you select some number, put them in a particular arrangement, and they again constitute a new higher level entity. A morpheme, as I showed with act, t and k get act and tack and cat. Different arrangements, different morphemes, so it's a new emergent. And the conditions, the type of arrangement are typically contiguous, one sequentially after another, although that's not necessarily so. For example, in Semitic languages, you often have a triconsonantal root, which don't have to be contiguous. Vowels can enter in between and so forth. So that's a counterexample. And the tones in Chinese are another counterexample. They cover the entire set of segmental phonemes. But apart from that, for the most part, the kind of arrangements of the phonemes are sequential and contiguous. And the constraint on their arrangement has a name in linguistics. It's called phonotactics. Those are the rules in any given language that govern which sequences of phonemes are permitted. So like in English, you can't say, you can say stick, but you can't say stick. I mean, it's not allowed as a possible combination. So, okay, so other demonstrations of the distinction between the phoneme level and the morpheme level to demonstrate its that it's a higher level emergent. I just gave one, the act and attack thing. Another one is a lot of morphemes, let's say, share the same sound as initial letter, like cat and cold and cut and could, but there's no apparent commonality of meaning that runs through those. So that's another demonstration of their working at two different levels. Or you might take, assume that, you might, if there were a closer relation, it might be that if there were conceptually a continuum, like the colors of a rainbow, so like red, orange, yellow, they form a kind of continuum in a sequence. Well, you might have expected that the phonemic representation of them might also fall in a sequence. So you might have red, reg, reg to move your way down your mouth. But no, it doesn't happen. And similarly, you might have thought that, going the other way around, if you had rib, referring to a kind of bone, well, you might have thought that if you went to rid, it would be collarbone, and ridge would be backbone, and rig would be whatever. But no, you don't have continuities. So they're really two autonomous systems, and that's why you want to call the morpheme an emergent. I mean, the only there is a kind of break of that. That's called sound symbolism or onomatopoeia, but that's another part of another discussion. Okay, the third one is morphemes into idioms, and I think most analysts wouldn't have included that, but I will. It's where you have separate morphemes, each with its own use as a morpheme, but you put them together, you get an idiom, which is a higher level unit because it has a new identity in its own right, a new meaning in its own right. It can't be predicted from its components. That's what an idiom means. Otherwise, it's compositional. So, and here's why it's important, by the way. I discovered, I gave this talk at a conference on language evolution, and there were a number of primatologists there. In fact, I talked to one whose name I forget, but if I ever write this down, I'll certainly cite her. She worked with a kind of monkey called a putty-nosed monkey, and which made two kinds of sounds. Let's see if I remember them. Oh, God. I'll just make up two sounds, but she gave them to me, but I don't have them. But I'll just make up two things. Something like, I'll just say honk and putt. Okay, so they make two kinds of sounds. And if they go honk, 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 it means something like, I'm kind of anxious, little anxiety, something might be going on out there. And put, it's kind of like fear, get out of the place. And but if you you can go honk 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 put. But if you suddenly go put honk put some kind of, you get an idiom. All of a sudden it means a new thing, and it means let's move to the next tree. So so anyway, so idioms are an ancient phenomenon in primates. So I wish I could have represented this correctly, but anyway, I did it schematically. So an example of idioms in English are first just to put two whole phrases together, to have it in for. So he has it in for me means have a grudge against and in plan revenge against the other person to repay the grudge. That's what have it in for means. And there's another idiom, have it out with, which has nothing to do with the first one. It means if you've had two people who've had a growing kind of disagreement between them, and if you have it out with each other, if one has it out with the other, then you finally air the grievances and try and work towards an expression, an open expression of what the problem is. Okay, so each idiom is composed of distinct elements, some of them same ones it seems, but together they give you a whole new meaning. And English, in fact, has a whole system of idioms built up out of a verb and a satellite, or verb and a satellite plus preposition. So, for example, take the verb to turn. Turn up means for something to get found, like my cufflink finally turned up, I'd lost it, finally turned up at the bottom of the hamper. I mean, that means it became found. Turn down is to reject. I turned down the proposal. Turn in, it means to go to sleep. I turned in for the night. No relation between any of these turning or in or any of these things. Any relation that you might see is fanciful. I mean, you might introject into it some kind of metaphoric sense, but it's not necessarily there. Turn out, for something to eventuate in a certain way, he turned out to be right all along. Means after some period, this is the way the actuality was. Turn on. She turned him on to Rilke means she roused his interest in. Rilke is a German poet. Turn over means to, like somebody turn the stolen property over to the police. To turn over is to give to the authorities, something like that. Okay, so that's, these are active systems in, as far as I can tell, every language. In fact, I suspect it's one of the main systems because without it, you'd have to have a vastly greater set of distinct morphemes. And apparently there's some constraint on the number of distinct morphemes you can remember with their sounds. It seems apparently easier to store combinations of these morphemes, each with its own new distinct meaning. So anyway, that's a third type. And a fourth type is, so that's also recombinant. It's also emergent because each idiom is an emergent new property. The fourth level of this is just syntax. It's or within a. Oh, I forgot to mention that all of these take place within a single word or across a sentence. So you have idioms within words too. For example, considerable. Well, it's from consider and able. It could be literal. It could mean able to be considered, but it's also an idiom. It means rather great. So you can have an idiom within a complex word made up of several morphemes. Okay, so within then the fourth level is you can have morphemes or idioms or words. Morphemes or words, whether they're idiomatic or not, incorporated into whole expressions. And this, again, is totally recombinant. Again, you have an inventory, the extended lexicon consisting of the morphemes and the idioms within it, and then you combine them in various patterns, and the combination is pretty much contiguous, sequential, and the constraint on it is what's called syntax, which you can spend your life on. But that's but in terms of, in other words, in a way, Chomsky and linguistics fits in at that corner. In terms of this perspective, I mean, that's where syntax fits in terms of this particular kind of analysis. Okay, so that's the formal property, and then semantically, you have similar kinds of things in terms of elements of meaning. And I'm saying that, I'm sorry, just to go back for a second, I'm saying that syntax is not an emergent thing because it's the meaning of the whole expression is pretty much derivable from the meanings of its components in their particular interrelations. So if you've got the interrelations, the constructions that they're part of, and the meanings of the morphemes, as well as long as you include the idiomatic elements within there, then you can pretty well derive the meaning, derive the whole sentence. It's not a higher entity. It's not a distinct new identity. It's compositional. Okay, now to the semantic level. Well, you've got, first of all, the semantic components that that go into the overall meaning of any single morpheme or idiom. So again, you've got, what is the nature of the inventory? Well, part of my earlier work that I spoke about earlier is there are two kinds of forms in languages. There are open class forms and closed class forms. The closed class forms, which are grammatical type forms like prepositions and conjunctions and inflections, that's my proposal, they are composed of semantic elements which come from a relatively closed inventory of possible grammatically usable concepts. It's a relatively closed inventory. It's universally available. All languages draw from it, but you don't use any concepts outside it. So it's relatively closed. So in that respect, the inventory that you draw from is relatively closed, and any given closed class form in any given language draws from that particular set of elements. And again, it takes from them, and its mode of combination is concurrent. The very semantic components are realized in the same instant as you hear the morpheme. And the constraint, the kind of pattern of arrangement that they go into is into a schema. So, and various linguists, including me and anybody who works on schemas, has been at some pains in characterizing how the different components, fundamental semantic components, relate to each other in these schemas, the particular patterns of arrangement and so forth. So I give one example of that, the preposition past in English, as in the ball sailed past my head at exactly 3 o'clock. Well, I gave that example earlier. I'm not going to go through it now, but you can, what I do provide in this handout is a repeat of what I did before, which is the numerous semantic components that go into this simple one morpheme past in their particular arrangement. For example, just to give you a quick example, if you say the ball sailed past my head, it means it passed through a point to one side of my head. If it didn't go through that, past that point, but went here, you'd say the ball sailed into my head. If it weren't horizontal but were vertical, you'd say the ball sailed down alongside me. If it were here in front of my head instead of the side, you'd say the ball sailed in front of my head. If it were here, you'd say the ball sailed over my head. So past has, to say it at all, you have to, its meaning consists of a certain set of fundamentally identifiable components in a particular schematic arrangement. Okay, well, that's the semantic part, and by gum, language evolved that too. I don't know if that exists in other cognitive systems, but it certainly exists in language. And just finally, the semantic, the meanings of individual morphemes and of idioms then combine together into the meanings, whole meanings of sentences and of discourse in general, in a kind of compositional way. It's an issue whether or not any given lexical item is an emergent or not. Whether, because there, and I give two arguments, pro and con. On the one hand, you could say, well, yeah, you could say, well, no, it's not an emergent because after all, the meaning of the morpheme, like the word past, is exactly and nothing more than the meaning of its components in their particular relationships. Or you could say, well, languages have these morphemes, they're kind of prepackaged units which don't let those components disperse. They package those units in a particular way. So maybe they do form a kind of packeted gestalt form of concepts. And so maybe they should be taken as a kind of higher level, separate new level entity. I don't know. Anyway, that gets you through the 6 or 8, depending on how you count, kind of ways in which language is discrete, is digital. So the upshot of all this is digitalness in languages is extensive. Furthermore, it has several different, possibly as many as 8 distinct kinds of digitalness, and given that there are different kinds of forms of arrangement and constraints on these arrangements, I mean, each of which could have perhaps evolved separately at separate times and on different bases. It's hierarchically structured, so there's, within digitalness itself, I've got 4 different components that make that up. And within the formal characteristics of digitalness, there's one sort of feeds into the next. Discreteness feeds into categoriality, which feeds into recombinance, which feeds into emergentness. So there's hierarchical in character. It's all very complicated. Okay, I think what I should next do is just skip to the part where I show how this digitalness that we've now established in language may have overcome the bottleneck. I'm going to try and show how some of these digital things compensated for the bottle part of the bottleneck. So we had a noisy medium. It's a noisy medium between people. How do you compensate for that? Because the medium for, I'm presuming that in the manual visual channel, it's a much cleaner medium. Unless there's a fog or something, it's easier to, our visual system is such that it can discern much more finely differentiated kinds of things. Whereas the vocal auditory channel is in the medium of sound, which can be, and at a distance can be rather noisy and rather poor. How do you overcome that? And it seems like digitalness has done that in several ways. First, it does it by making sure that, first of all, by discreteness itself, so that you know that you've got one or another identity of unit, instead of having to discern some degree of gradients, and where things hinge on whether or not you've got the right degree of gradients. Instead, you just have to have enough to identify, am I in this unit or am I in that unit? So discreteness helps. It also helps to have a relatively small inventory, a known inventory, pre-known, which is agreed on between the sender and the receiver, so that you know that the units are only going to be of a certain set number and nothing outside it. So all that helps you overcome the low fidelity. Okay, so one of the other things was the fact that spoken language was low in parallelness. It had very few parallel parameters going on at the same time, which meant that somebody playing a video game? Which meant that, as contrasted with sign language, relatively less information could be conveyed over because you've got fewer channels to convey it over, lower bandwidth. What's the way to compensate for that? Well, because that'll slow you down. Well, you compensate for it by having greater speed, and you get greater speed by having digitalness, because if you can identify units quicker, I mean more accurately, you can introduce them into the channel at a quicker rate. So you have your loss of speed over low bandwidth is compensated for by greater distinctness of the digital character. I mean, the same is true in electronic formats today. I mean, it's just the same logic, I think, which evolution overcame. Let's see what time it is. 5:35. Oh, we're getting late. Okay. I'm going to skip the rest of this. I mean, you get the idea of what I mean by compensations. And very quickly just go to section 9 in part 4, I guess. And I'll just, since it's pretty late, I'll just give kind of like a taste of what I have in mind for this. The issue is, as I stated before, the issue is, by the way, an earlier version of this is written. This handout represents my latest thinking, which is more advanced than the written version. But the written version, again, I promised to mention it every talk. Everything I've written is on my website, including this new paper that I'm just talking about. It's on my website. What is it called? It's called Recombinants in the Evolution of Language. So anyway, the idea is that do other cognitive systems have anything like this kind of digitalness? And if so, 2 steps of digitalness, namely discreteness and categoriality, I think do exist in other cognitive systems with some extensiveness. So, for example, within visual perception, the mere fact that you can identify an object, a bottle, just look at it and know that it's a bottle, well, it's visual, or a rock, whatever. Identities of objects are discrete kinds of things. They're not continuous. So that's an aspect of discreteness and categoriality in vision. Maybe you have them in motor control. Maybe there are discrete motions like bending at the waist or bending at the knee could be considered a discrete motor element. Maybe some part of your cognition treats it that way. I don't know. If so, then we've got something similar there. The fact that hue within vision, hue, namely color, I mean like red, green, yellow, is discrete in a way that brightness and saturation are not. Usually color is defined in terms of hue, brightness, saturation. Well, brightness is a gradient, brighter or fainter. Saturation is a gradient. Hue is not. So the way our cognition treats color perception, it treats one of them, two of the aspects as a gradient, as an analog kind of thing. One of them it treats as a discrete categorical kind of thing. Okay, so we've got this the affect system, probably or perhaps animals and certainly humans, I would suppose, but perhaps chimpanzees could experience, insofar as they're conscious of them, meta-conscious of them, that anger is a different, categorially distinct emotion from affection. So there could be categoriality. It's not just one gradient affective system. Like hue, there may be experienced discrete kinds of emotion. Okay, so that exists. And language would have had no problem copying that, borrowing that, tapping into that, whatever, however it could have established that relation. But it's less clear and you're harder put to identify forms of recombination and emergentness in other cognitive systems. There are potential candidates. For example, there is a theory of geons by a particular perception psychologist, which believes that there are distinct categories of basic fundamental visual forms. The thing is, what's his name again? He was, I know he was influenced by language in his theory, so he may have, maybe going backwards. But anyway, the notion that there are different geons, like cylindrical shapes, flat shapes, loops, whatever, and objects, the full shape of objects can be characterized as, for example, cylinders attached to another cylinder with a sphere attached to the cylinder, something seen in that way. If so, fine. Maybe we've got, with the result as an emergent kind of thing, human form, fine. Then maybe there's some kind of recombinance there. So maybe that's an example. Maybe you have examples in motor control. So maybe bending at the waist and bending at the knee combined together gives you a gestalt emergent pattern, a notion of sitting as a sitting motor pattern. So maybe we have examples in all sorts of examples maybe with pre-hominid examples, like, for example, you see mating rituals in various animals, like stickleback fish. I mean, the female does one kind of motion, the male does another, and the female does a different one. And if you're the right species, then you go through a succession of patterns, which then say, okay, it's okay to mate or something like that. So maybe that's an example of gestalt, of an emergent, higher level thing made up of components. The thing, though, is it gets kind of hard to find definitive cases of it, whereas the language ones are so clear and so definitive and so pervasive that, again, we don't know. I mean, much more research will be needed at this particular interface to see if language evolved it afresh or borrowed it and elaborated it all to hell. We don't know. And then the last thing, which we won't have, I'll end here, but the last thing that we'll have time for is whether or not thought co-evolved with language so that our aspects of our thought are now much more digital than they were before. So this is the 10th lecture, the last one out of 10. I thought I'd just say that I feel like I'm one of the early entrants in the Olympics, and in particular the decathlon, which is 10 events, and it's maybe I'm a harbinger of further Olympics to come. But okay, thanks.